Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel, The Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today my guest is Dr. Jennifer Vonk. She is professor of comparative/cognitive psychology at Oakland University. Her primary research interests are in two overlapping areas, animal cognition and cognitive development. The underlying goal of her work is to examine cognitive continuities and discontinuities between humans and both closely and distantly related species. So, Dr. Vonk, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so you study comparative and cognitive psychology. Just for people to have a better notion of what we're talking about from the very beginning of our conversation, what exactly is comparative psychology? Is it studying several different species of animals and then comparing certain traits that they have with traits that they share or not with us humans?
You know, it's an interesting question because to be truly comparative, one would think that we should be studying a variety of different species. And usually we're interested in that because we want to understand what kind of explains the different, in my case, I'm really interested in cognition, so the cognitive capacities that different species have, to try to understand why those things emerge. So we can look at species that are differently related, whether they're closely related to humans or not, the kind of foraging structures that they have, the social structures, did they evolve to live in groups and so on. So you can really only understand the factors that would give rise to different abilities if you're comparing a large number of species from different evolutionary paths with different foraging ecologies and different social structures. But a lot of people who identify as comparative psychologists really focus on a single species or a set of very closely related species. So they might work only with non-human primates or work only with rats or pigeons, common kind of lab animals. So I think historically when we think of comparative psychology, sometimes it's more about comparing human behavior to one other species if we're using that species as a model for human behavior. So there, I guess, lots of different ways that we could define it. I like to think that it should be more broadly comparative, but almost always with the goal of comparing to humans in some way within psychology anyways. I think biologists are a little more interested in animals for their own sake, and in psychology a lot of it is driven by how can we better understand why humans are the way they are by comparing to other species.
Yeah, but I would guess it takes a lot of people to study different species and then to compare them with humans because, I mean, I think it would not be reasonable for the same person or a small group of people to try to study all the different animals that exist and then, apart from that, also comparing their cognitive structures or even other things like sociality and other things that to humans, right?
Yeah, so that makes a great point. I think one of the things that we've been talking about within the field lately is the importance of large-scale collaborative studies because you just don't, somebody's doing something in one lab with the species they work with and the methods and the facilities aren't the same in another lab. So if we collaborate, we can have people doing sort of analogous things with different species where we can more directly compare. And that there's been some work like Sarah Benson Amron had a really nice paper looking at 30 different species or something from 9 different groups that in several different zoos that were all solving the same kind of puzzle box, which is a fairly simple task. But and then Evan McLean and Brian Hare had a nice study looking at inhibition across a lot of different primate species. And so we're starting to get better at those kind of collaborative efforts to test a lot of different species in the same procedure. But it is definitely challenging. And I think there's a little bit of a trade-off for if you're working with one species, you can really develop expertise and know that animal inside out. And then if you're someone like me who has a little bit of like one study on this species and now we're working with something else, there's always such a big learning curve just in understanding what are their sensory systems, like what do they see, like do they hear, like do they depend on olfaction, like you're always learning. And I think that people expect you, if you do animal behavior, to be expert on all species. And like you say, it's not possible. They're all so different and so specialized. And so yeah, we definitely have to benefit from more, crosstalk. So.
Yes, and what kinds of species do you focus on the most? Is it primate species, that is the ones which we are part of, together with gorillas and chimps and bonobos and other interesting guys like that?
My favorite. So, I mean, my first foray into animal behavior was actually with Mongolian gerbils when I was an undergrad. But as a graduate student, I went on to work with non-human primates, and I really focused on that for a while, mostly the great apes. So I worked with orangutans and gorillas and then chimpanzees during my postdoc, and then later when I was a faculty member in Mississippi. But there I started working with bears as well, because I was working with a little privately owned zoo that had access, and bears have become kind of my favorite species to work with for many reasons. So I'd like to continue. Mostly it's been work with black bears, a little bit with grizzlies, but I'd really like to continue doing more. And so we've done more with other carnivore species. So domestic cats mostly, but some wild cats. A little bit with foxes and coyotes and dog species. So I think carnivores are a really interesting group. And then we've got a number of studies. So something with horses and porcupines and bats I was working with for a while. Something with macaws and prosocial behavior. And so skunks, we did some causal reasoning studies. So we're kind of greedy. Anything we can get our hands on that we have access to, there's always an interesting question to ask. So.
Mm-hmm. And in what kinds of aspects can we compare humans to other non-human animals? Okay, so perhaps this is a very general question.
Yes.
Perhaps it's better to ask you what kinds of cognitive aspects are you interested in studying in other species and then compare them to humans?
I guess what, as psychologists, we tend to gravitate towards are the things that we think make humans unique. So, because then we can kind of chip away at, well, first of all, is this really unique to humans? And then if it is shared with other species, which other species? And that can tell us something about maybe why we have that ability. So we've looked, like theory of mind is a very interesting topic. It's really hard to test well. So most of my work in that area has been more kind of critiques of other people's work and less testing of it, because I think it's just, I'd love to know more about how other animals represent maybe mental states in other species, but it's so hard to design a test that really gets at that. So that and concept formation, like how abstract of concepts can you represent things that are unobservable? So, I mean, we know that animals can form fairly complicated concepts about food items and what's prey versus predators and humans versus other species and things like that. But we don't really know if they have concepts for things like freedom and death and those things that don't really take on physical form. So that's really interesting and depends a lot on maybe language abilities. So I think the extent to which they can learn to use symbolic systems, then we get into counting and numerosity and those concepts. So that, and do they reason about cause and effect, or is it all trial and error learning? Those are all kind of things that distinguish humans. The ability to know about your own thoughts, so metacognition, and then prosocial behavior. So humans tend to be kind of unique, it seems, in doing things to help others, even when there's a cost to themselves. And in animals, there's some very striking examples, like in vampire bats, the fact that they give up a blood meal to someone else who hasn't fed. So we historically kind of thought that was always explained by kinship, but there seem to be cases like that where they're really willing to make a sacrifice for an animal that's not related to them, and then we really want to know why. So those are kind of, I guess, big questions that people have been chipping away at for years, but we still don't really have definitive answers, which makes it exciting. Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, so look, I've read this book that you edited together with Dr. Todd Shackelford. I think it is the Oxford Handbook of comparative evolutionary psychology, because, you know, I'm one of those mad guys that read 700-page textbooks also to prepare for interviews. So,
Wow.
okay, so, and it's very interesting that in that book you try to give us a new perspective and joining together comparative and evolutionary psychology, I guess, because I linked it immediately with the concept of phylogeny. That is, we can try to study other species and know, looking back at the evolutionary tree and knowing where exactly did they branch off from our lineage, let's say, and then determine at what point during evolution did a certain cognitive trait, for example, developed in a particular
Yes.
species, and then over time how it evolved through other species, and after that arriving at humans in perhaps a completely novel form. So we have two aspects in this picture that I guess that is. One of them is just it is a basic feature of evolution, natural evolution in this case, that nature is very conservative. That is, a new trait gets created, and then over evolution, if it works well, it is kept along subsequent species, new species, but at the same time it can change under different environmental pressures, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so, and I don't know how much that the ideas we present in that book are really novel, but we had kind of noticed that evolutionary psychology and comparative psychology were kind of operating separately. So there, I mentioned earlier that we are trying to develop better crosstalk between just researchers working on different species. But I think there's so many places in our fields where there's such a dichotomy, like even within primatologists, fairly narrow, like field researchers versus lab researchers don't always communicate. And so it seemed odd to us that in biology, everybody's kind of accepting and working from this evolutionary framework. And then within psychology, it's kind of odd that we have it as a separate sub-discipline. It shouldn't really be its own discipline. It should just be a theoretical perspective that we apply across areas like development and social psychology and cognition and comparative. We should all be using an evolutionary framework because it is the best explanation we have for why traits have evolved and are maintained and so on. And then it's kind of weird that within psychology, evolutionary psychologists almost exclusively work with humans and only humans and haven't really been looking at our lineage and the phylogenetic history and so on. So that's where we kind of felt there was a need to say, hey, more people asking these evolutionary questions like mate selection, mate preferences, and so on should be doing that in other species for comparison. And comparative psychologists should do a better job of sometimes framing their hypotheses in terms of evolutionary processes instead of, like, sometimes we're guilty, and I've been guilty of this too, of just saying, oh, well, this cool study has been done in human children. Let's see if this species can do it, or dogs are doing this. Let's see if cats can do it, without really saying, well, why would we expect cats to have the same ability that dogs have? Or why do we expect important differences? And what about their development would make us predict differences or similarities? And so that was kind of our goal in saying we need better theoretical justification and we need more species compared. And these two fields can come together and do this instead of being separate. So, and I think people have, kind of appreciated that for a long time, but it's just putting it into practice is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and would you say that it is possible for us to trace sort of an evolutionary history of the development of particular cognitive traits? That is, for example, I know that gorillas branched off from our lineage earlier than chimps, for example. That is, our common ancestor with gorillas is much older than
Right.
our common ancestor with chimps. Is it true that, for example, certain cognitive traits that we can find both in humans, chimps, and gorillas are more developed from gorillas to chimps and then to humans?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated, I mean, that is kind of the goal of a lot of these comparative analyses, but I think it becomes so complicated because sometimes a species at one point in their history had an ability and lost it subsequently. So we don't always know, like, if gorillas aren't, for example, showing mirror self-recognition, but chimpanzees are, is it that that's something that emerged later when chimpanzees branched off from the common ancestor with gorillas, or is it that an earlier common ancestor had that capacity and then gorillas subsequently didn't need it for whatever reason? So I think it's really challenging because we can't recreate with cognitive abilities, we can't test extinct species and the ancestors. And so we can kind of surmise from the archaeological records, things like tool use and so on in the Homo lineage, but with other species, it's just, there's a lot of speculation, which I think, like, you're always kind of looking after the fact and guessing what was happening in the past, but you can't really test those things. And of course, as an experimental psychologist, we kind of learned that you can't talk about cause and effect unless you can manipulate variables and see the results, and you can never do that in the past. So it's kind of like the best we can do is compare these existing species and make those inferences, but I don't know how definitive we can be sometimes in those cases. So I mean, I think it tells us something if, old world monkeys and great apes have a capacity, like it seems like they do much better on tests of metacognition that we've developed, but New World monkeys don't seem to show that capacity. I don't know that prosimians have really been tested, but we wouldn't really expect them to. So that probably tells us that that emerged fairly late in our evolutionary history if it's consistent.
Okay, and you also study cognitive development, and I guess that the word that goes associated with that, we already talked about phylogeny here, but what is related to development in this case is ontogeny, right? That
Yes.
is studying how over the life history of a particular species, the cognitive traits arise, correct?
Yeah, so I've always been kind of influenced by that idea that the phylogeny or ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the famous kind of quote.
I was about to ask you about that, but go ahead.
Yeah, so this idea that if something developed late in our evolutionary history, it probably emerges late within the developmental lifespan of a child. So we see things like theory of mind. I mean, there's debates now with people claiming that 10-month-old infants are showing some evidence of at least implicit kind of precursors to theory of mind. But historically, we thought that was something that isn't really fully developed by the age of 4 or 5. So it's fairly late compared to other capacities like language is coming on board earlier. So it makes sense that that might be something that's unique. I think I guess, if you think in terms of brain development about whether these are systems that have been kind of built on top of the existing systems, which my postdoc advisor, Danny Povinelli, talked a lot about reinterpretation of things in terms of mental states. And it's not like the entire cognitive architecture has been rebuilt in humans, but we've developed subsequently this capacity to reinterpret things in terms of hidden internal mental states. But that's built on this capacity to reason about behaviors and to predict what happens when you can observe someone acting in a certain way. And so if it's something that's kind of added on, it should be something that maybe isn't quite so innate and hardwired and comes on board first. And I guess you can look at hemispheric specialization and so on. So things like language are more resilient to brain damage and so on, but spatial memory and the more commonly shared or widely shared abilities seem a little bit harder to recover. So there's kind of more hints about whether something's a new development in evolutionary history. I'm not really an expert on neuroanatomy, so I hesitate to say too much about that. But Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, I think, in using developmental processes to kind of recapture the phylogenetic history.
Okay, and to what extent does the knowledge that we obtain from how, for example, chimps behave, because they are the species, I guess, that is the closest to us in our evolutionary history? How does that knowledge allow for us to perhaps make extrapolations to how, for example, Homo sapiens in the Pleistocene might have behaved in environments that were more natural than the ones we inhabit nowadays in the modern world, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question because, of course, there's differences in the social, the environment, and technology, and so on. But I I don't know how much there's parallels in the social structure with early hominids and living chimpanzees today. And, the brain structures are, I mean, there are a lot of differences. I guess it's also one thing I kind of try to shy away from are those kind of direct comparisons. We're saying, a chimp today would be like a human at this or that age or at this place in history, because there's still different species that have evolved to solve different evolutionary problems. And I mean, I'm sure there are similarities in terms of kind of hunting and subsistence kind of problems, but I guess I'm not expert enough in early humans that I would want to make too many parallels there. And the chimpanzees that I've worked with I haven't done any field work with chimpanzees, so I've always worked with captive animals. So it works okay for asking these kinds of cognitive questions about, are they capable of forming this or that concept? Can they see relations between stimuli, and what are their memory processes? But when you start getting into like social behavior and what's typical and natural and interactions between group members, there's always that risk that the captive environment is not natural enough. So that is kind of one of the reasons I stick with some of the more basic cognitive process research. I mean, I'm interested in social behaviors, but I know that there's the danger of kind of, does this generalize to the species in their natural environment? So someone else would probably answer that question much better than I can.
Okay, fair enough. I've asked on purpose about the Pleistocene period because it is the period that, for example, evolutionary psychologists usually refer to as the one during which supposedly our species evolved the cognitive traits that we still have nowadays. And so when people, for example, study chimps or even other species, but they refer most of the time to chimps due to their closeness to us, let's say from an evolutionary perspective, and for example they see that they sometimes invade other troops and kill all the males and things like that, people immediately start freaking out and think, oh my god, did we do this in the Pleistocene when we were hunter-gatherers living in the wild or something like that? So.
Well, I mean, we do that kind of thing today, So I think people want to see parallels to other animals only in the positive behavior. So they like the studies that say, oh, look how pro-social we are and how altruistic, and maybe this comes from our relatives. But as soon as we see chimps doing something, and there's cases of cannibalism and of primates, of infants and so on, it's like, oh no, we're not at all like that. And then we start leaning towards trying to separate ourselves. But I mean, we have all kinds of horrific examples in the modern day of things that we're doing to each other that it's not so different. There's the same kind of fights over land and access to mates and so on. We may not see chimpanzees fighting over cultural beliefs and religious traditions and so on, but territory and access to mates, it's kind of a common denominator, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is a fair question because I guess that it is a very difficult one, but would you say that the cognitive traits that we have, or even other types of traits that have to do with our sociality and things like that, the aspects in which we differ from other primates, and particularly from chimps, would be due to the fact that we went through some very specific environmental pressures. For example, there are people that refer even to, I think that this comes from Robin Dunbar, the social brain hypothesis, because we lived in environments that were much more socially complex, let's say, and also because we developed certain technologies like fire that then allowed us to start cooking our food and turn into more efficient the process of extracting nutrients from it and things like that. So perhaps what I'm trying to ask you is if these episodes in our evolutionary history that led to our more developed brains, I think that if that by itself would be enough to explain the differences between us and other species.
Yeah, I mean, that is the great question, I think, in the field. I mean, I suspect it's not any one thing. So in testing these hypotheses, the social intelligence hypothesis has had a lot of value, and it's been really highly stressed. But it's almost led researchers to focus only on species with social complexity. So now, I mean, luckily, we're branching outside of primates and saying, well, what about corvids, which are doing some really fascinating things, and cetaceans and other species that live in these complex social groups, dogs as well, seem to have a lot of what we refer to as advanced or sophisticated cognitive processes.
Could you just please give us an example of a cetacean, just for the public to understand?
Whales, so large sea mammals. So dolphins and whales seem to have very complex social structures and also very complex cognitive abilities. They're much more challenging to test in some of these tests, but we've definitely moved away, I think, from just looking at animals that are closely related to us and looking at animals that have some similarities in social structure, and largely due to those kind of hypotheses. But then on the flip side, we've maybe neglected other things, like Sol has a nice hypothesis about the unpredictability of the environment. And if the environment is constantly changing, and we know that humans have adapted probably to more different environments than most other species, aside from insects maybe, which is a really drastic comparison. But I mean, we also build technology to shape the environment to meet our needs, which is something that no other species does. And so I suspect it's a combination of all these factors, like diet, like you mentioned, eating meat and cooking seems to have led to advancements in brain structure, but then the social structure, the need to work together, agriculture. So we're kind of exploiting other aspects of the environment that requires cooperation, which requires understanding the intentions of others. And so it's possible that we were driven to exploit those aspects of the environment because we would be outcompeted if it was sheer force or speed or other facets that allow other predators like crocodiles that haven't evolved nearly as much over the same kind of period of time. We don't have that advantage, so the advanced kind of thinking, the ability to make predictions, causal relationships we can reason about, that probably gave us an advantage over other species, which would have led those abilities to continue to be passed on and so on. So I kind of think of it as a whole, conglomeration of different factors and pressures coming together in just the right way. And so I think it's hard for us when we try to focus on stressing its sociality or its foraging or its, X, Y, or Z. It's not going to be one thing that explains it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that we also have this other tool, let's say, that is cumulative knowledge, that is one of the aspects of our culture, correct? And I guess that gives us a huge advantage, the fact that we can accumulate and expand our knowledge over vast amounts of time and over generations.
Yeah.
That I guess doesn't really happen, if I'm correct, in any other species. That are other species which have culture, correct, but not really cumulative culture or knowledge, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely evidence of traditions being passed down, but there's not like a record of those things outside of the individuals themselves. Whereas we're obviously developing books and things like your podcast, and somewhere people can go and find something long after we're not here. And that is definitely really unique. It's kind of an interesting question, not, I guess, to turn it on its ear, not why have we developed the capacity or the habits to do this, but why no other species has developed those things. So I don't know if that's just we've kind of dominated the environment to the extent that we're suppressing the evolution of those kinds of traits in other species. I don't know, but it is surprising to some extent that our species and our species alone engages in social learning and teaching to that extent. So valuable.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because a few minutes ago you even referred to people that make comparisons with insects that sometimes already seem a bit far-fetched to compare humans to insects and things like that. But so would you say that there's perhaps a phylogenetic threshold or something like that, that is a point beyond which it is no longer useful to establish comparisons between humans and other animal species just because they are really too far apart?
I actually really hesitate to do that just because in some sense it feels a little bit arrogant to say only if you're similar enough to humans in these ways could you possibly have this trait. And we don't really know, so birds, for instance, their brains are very different from human brains, but we see all this behavior in corvids, crows, and ravens that seem to be able to do things like maybe reason about cause and effect and use tools in an effective way and predict future behaviors and so on, even though they're really evolutionarily distant from us and their brain structures are very different. So I feel like it would do a disservice to kind of make assumptions about we can't possibly find these similar behaviors or traits, or they probably would be explained by very different mechanisms in species that are very different, but that's what's kind of interesting. So if we look at social insects and say, oh, look, there's this great organization of behavior and they seem to do things that are kind of altruistic, but then we know that it's all kind of controlled by chemical signals and it doesn't really mean the same kind of sophistication of cognitive processes. It also tells us that it's possible for a lot of really complex behavior to be explained through simpler mechanisms, which I think is a good lesson for explaining even human behavior. So I would never want to not look for something in a species just because we assume they shouldn't have that capacity, because we may be missing something really interesting where something has developed for a completely different reason or through a completely different mechanism. So
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's also interesting that you refer or you give the example of corvids, because I was just thinking, would it be possible for us to put on the table the hypothesis that between species, even if they are evolutionarily distant, let's say, due to phenomena of convergent evolution, because they had to solve similar problems in similar environments, even if they are somewhat distant, that it would make sense for them to develop similar cognitive tools, let's say?
yeah, exactly. And I think that is something that we've neglected until the last couple of decades, really. And so people are somewhat surprised in all these experimental tests of corvid behavior and cognition. And even in dogs, it took us a really long time to realize, they're really good at picking up on communicative cues, even from humans, which we're not always very good at reading cues from other species. This is something they may be better at than we are. And so I think just recognizing that has opened up all kinds of avenues for testing hypotheses about why traits have evolved. So I'd rather kind of just be open to test. I think there has to be a rationale. I think, maybe it's kind of foolish to look for, like I recently tried to do a study on cooperative behaviors in domestic cats, which I thought was a good idea and an important comparison, but maybe it's silly to expect them, given their environmental, their evolutionary history, to engage in those kinds of behaviors. So we shouldn't just like randomly pick topics that don't make sense in another species. But I also think we should be open to the fact that it is possible they can solve something. And modeling experiments often show, through simple algorithms, that these things can happen for completely different reasons than we suspect. And you don't always understand that until you look at what we would describe as a simpler organism. I try to kind of steer away from saying simpler or, less than, because I think we have really biased our studies by placing humans kind of atop this, like everything's evolved to be more human-like, which of course we know isn't really a good way of portraying things, but it's kind of our human-centric bias to do that. So I try not to answer questions about which species is smarter or, better in some way, because like you allude to the fact that everything is adapting to solve a problem that's present in their environment, and other species have been very successful in doing that. Like I mentioned, crocodiles that haven't needed to evolve in millions of years because they're effective the way they are. So yeah, I don't know that it's helpful to kind of neglect things that could be happening in other species.
Yes, and isn't it also a shame if people have this sort of anthropocentric approach to comparative psychology or to studying the cognitive traits of different species? Because, for example, there are species that have cognitive traits that humans do not share with them, that are sort of almost exclusive to them. So, for example, echolocation
Right.
in bats. And we could even say, if we could put us outside of an anthropocentric view, that sort of cognitive ability is something superior to something that humans lack, because we completely lack this sort of ability, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's one of my favorite examples to use, the echolocation, because I'm sure that it drastically transforms the way they see the world. But it's also difficult for us because we don't have that ability to even conceive of what that would be like, which then makes it hard for us to design tests of, how this influences cognition. So I think, it's easy, and I've done this, to criticize all of us for taking this anthropocentric bias, but then when trying to step outside of that, it's like, how do you design a test to see if an animal has a concept that you don't have yourself? Are we even capable? And people have done a great job of looking at like honeybee vision, for instance, and understanding that the way they see the world, that many more colors than we do potentially. And so we have the technology to try to see how their brains are representing things. But if they have concepts or senses that we don't have, it's going to be very difficult for us to put ourselves in that mindset and ask the right questions about those abilities. So I think we are kind of limited by our own cognition, even in terms of the questions we're ever going to ask or uncover the realities behind. But it is, at least we can take that step forward of kind of appreciating, like you have done, that there are other species that have skills and abilities beyond ours, and it doesn't make sense to just hold ourselves out as this kind of ideal or optimized kind of model.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, sometimes I get a bit frustrated with philosophers of mind because, for example, some of them have picked up on the example of echolocation in bats to say that, oh, because bats have this sort of ability, they automatically must have a kind of consciousness that is different from our consciousness. But then I start thinking, but we don't even know at all how our consciousness works
Yeah.
and about what cognitive aspects are even part of our
Yeah.
consciousness. So how can you be so sure that because bats have this cognitive trait that their consciousness works in a way that is completely different from our own, right?
Yeah. No, and then maybe that makes the point that it should always be a good starting point to understand how things work in humans really well first before trying to presume how it might work in another species. But sometimes we can do more in other species to try to figure out how things work because we can manipulate things in a way in experimental environments that we're not going to do with humans. So, but yeah, I mean that there are a lot of assumptions and speculations being made with these very human-centric biases that are hard for us to shake. I mean, it's easy to say it's bad to do that, but it's hard for any of us not to. So, yeah. But I also think that people sometimes, when in philosophy, I mean, there's a lot of really brilliant theorizing, but you get such a different perspective in actually doing the lab work and working with animals. And there are some philosophers like Kristen Andrews and Robert Lurtz, you know, they're working with animals or doing work with chimpanzees and they're designing experiments. I think it just gives you a completely different perspective because even though chimpanzees so closely related to us, just things like changing a very small aspect of a stimulus can completely throw them off where they're not responding, or it looks like they're responding to a task because they know how to solve it, but really they have a bias towards the property of an object that leads to a correct response. And sometimes we really have to take a step back and say, not just, oh, hey, they're solving our task the way we designed it, they must have the same capacity, but then kind of post hoc rule out all the different ways that they could have come to that. But we should be doing that with humans too. So we don't always apply the same standards when human infants or nonverbal human children solve a task. It's, oh, you know, they must be using theory of mind. We know they ultimately developed that, but maybe they're not using theory of mind to solve the task either. And I think we're either way too critical on the human experiments and not enough on the infant or the animal experiments and not the infant experiments, or we're too quick to jump on the animal experiments when it's popular to say, hey, this is evidence of such and such an ability, instead of really figuring out why we got that level of performance in the task. So, and I'm just as guilty of that too. I don't mean to point fingers at everyone else in the field. It's easy to get excited by a result and kind of lose track of trying to further the understanding of why we got the result.
Yeah, we all have our cognitive biases and our heuristics, and we can't really get rid of those things because they operate subconsciously. And so
Yeah,
it is better not to blame people for
right.
being a bit
For being
anthropocentric
human.
when, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's adaptive to have those biases. There's a reason why we have them. So it works in some situations, maybe not always in science perfectly, but
Yeah, science is a bit counterintuitive, let's say.
maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And just another thing, because it seems that there's this tricky thing about studying animals in different environments. For example, studying them in the lab and in the wild, because it seems that there are people that say that it is not that we have to be careful when studying animals in the lab because they might not behave exactly as they would do in the wild. But on the other hand, there are good examples of animals that, because they were trained to do certain things in the lab, they showed sort of behavioral flexibility, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always the trade-off, I think, between the kind of control you can have in a lab setting versus the naturalness of the behavior in the wild. So, and I mean, wild settings, humans are encroaching so much upon anyways that we're influencing the way animals are behaving when we're observing them in the wild, not to the same extent. I think it's it does depend, like I was saying earlier, on the kind of question you're asking, how much you expect that the outcome is shaped by the environment they're in. I think, lab animals have sometimes outperformed what wild animals would do because they're exposed to human artifacts. Or, if chimpanzees are following point cues or eye gaze cues, it may be through extensive experience with humans that wild chimpanzees may not have. So there definitely may be differences in abilities and behaviors because of the environment. If we could ideally do the same studies in both environments, we'd have a better sense. But of course, a lot of what we do in the lab, you can't do in the wild because you don't have this captive primate that's transfixed by what you're presenting. Their food isn't dependent on performing in the task like it can be in the lab. So not only is their experience different, but their motivations are different to perform in a certain way, or they're more neophobic. And so there's just so many confounding variables. I think one of my favorite quotes was Adam McCloskey was talking about domestication and dog behavior and was pointing out that for dogs, captivity is the norm, whereas for chimps, it's not. So we get those things kind of confounded, captivity versus the wild, with what's natural and what isn't, and treat them like they're synonymous, but they're not. And so it's definitely, I mean, an important question. I think that we all have to consider is, does this really tell us about, for example, chimpanzees in general, or does it only tell us something about captive chimpanzees raised in this very particular environment? So, yeah. And we're never going to solve that perfectly, because to do some of the studies, we have to take them out of the wild environment. And so we know, what's their rearing history? Were they exposed to this before or not? Are we presenting the task for the first time? You never know those things with wild animals. So, and I'm not necessarily advocating for having animals in captivity, because I think that's another important question, and there's a lot more ethical discussion now about whether it's even right to do any kind of experiments on certain kinds of animals in the lab. And it's a tough one, because the research has revealed so many really important things. I mean, biomedical research as well as cognitive research, but does that justify, what we're doing to these animals? Whole other topic for conversation.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that it is a very important point to know about comparative psychology and cognitive psychology, because okay, let's say that we're trying to understand at what level of development a certain cognitive trait is in a certain species. Let's say that we're studying, for example, theory of mind, and we do some tests in the wild to test at what level of development is theory of mind, for example, in chimps. But then we put them in a lab environment, and theory of mind, let's say, goes up in terms of development. So,
Yeah.
so what can we really say? That the level of theory of mind in terms of development in chimps is the one that they experience in the wild, or the one that they experience in the lab, right?
Well, I mean, to me, the interesting part about that would be saying that it's flexible in some way, that it can be shaped through development. Because if it's just kind of hardwired that it's going to come online at a certain point in development, then that it's not very amenable to changes. And so I guess if we know that theory of mind can be something that can be shaped, we kind of go back to the questions we had a couple of decades ago about, even if chimps don't naturally express theory of mind or exhibit it in the wild, if you raise them in human homes or in a human social cultural environment, are they going to express that? And that would tell us that they're not limited by their biological makeup, that experience can actually provide attributes that might otherwise not be present. And I think that would tell us something really important about what biological structures or genetics have to be in place to have those abilities. So I think, if we could do the comparisons, if we could do the same kinds of tests where the analogies really held up in those very different environments, it would be hugely informative. It's just the trick is thinking of something where it's not confounded by the fact that chimps in the lab haven't been mother reared or they haven't had access to siblings to play with. I mean, we know how that affects human development if you're not interacting with other individuals, experts in society and parents, and you don't have the affection and attachment. And so it's all very, very messy. I sound very pessimistic about our ability to ever kind of shed light on these things, but I guess I don't think it does us any favors to kind of gloss over all the intricacies and the challenges that we face. And we've made a lot of progress in the last several decades, there's no doubt about it, but there's still a long way to go, I think, before we have clear answers about some of these things.
Yes, and that's very interesting because I guess that there are a lot of people still that when they're talking about a certain species and a certain cognitive trait, and they refer to the fact that at this point in that species evolutionary history, that trait that they have is developed until this point, let's say, I guess that they're usually trying to say that they went through an evolutionary history and they had to deal with certain evolutionarily relevant problems that they had to solve in order to successfully survive and reproduce. And at this point in their history, that particular cognitive trait is developed like this. But I mean, we can't really separate the individual or the species from its environment, because if we put them in another environment, then their traits get expressed in different and perhaps even novel ways.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing too, is sometimes there was a couple of years ago, there was kind of a renewed appreciation for talking about even motivation, but that danger of so an animal's not exhibiting a certain trait, behavior, what have you, does that mean it's not capable, or is it just not motivated, or have we not provided the right environmental stimulation to see the behavior expressed? So there are, I mean, there's always that also the limitation on we're only studying a small number often of animals in zoo settings. We might have access to like 3 bears of a species or 1 elephant that we can work with. And so knowing the extent to which what they're doing is unique to their own background and environment and can be generalized is always going to be a challenge for those kinds of species. So kind of have an advantage when working with animals that can be housed in large numbers. So insects, a little bit easier, rats a little bit easier, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so great, Dr. Vonk. Just before we go, would you like to share with people both where they can follow your work online and also perhaps some interesting piece of work you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's just jennifervonk.com. I try to keep fairly up to date with publications and also the graduate students currently in the lab. So I have 8 graduate students at the moment that are all working on very different projects. So we kind of run the gamut of looking at prosocial behavior and metacognition and memory processes. And someone's looking at pattern learning in cats. And so we're some might say a little unfocused. We're just I like to encourage students to tackle the things that are really most interesting to them, as long as I think it's something I can support them through. And so some of the projects we're trying to get at, I think, a little bit more general understanding of capacities that can be broadly compared. So one of my doctoral students that graduated last year was looking at behavioral flexibility through inhibition and innovation in this multi-access puzzle box. And so there are 4 different ways that an animal can gain access to a reward inside a box. But once they learn a solution, it's locked, essentially. So they have to learn another solution. So you can look at how long they perseverate on that task, how quickly they learn another method. And so we've been extending that beyond the bears and cats she was looking at. So we've tested it in porcupines and binturongs, and we're hoping to test coyotes, and I'm hoping to test raccoons, just wild raccoons as well. So we're trying to get a bit better at tasks that they might be naturally motivated to do that don't require extensive training, where we can compare a lot of different species in a similar setting. So that's kind of the, one direction we're trying to take, which I'm still kind of learning to do a better job of saying, what is this animal's natural behavior and how can we understand it better, instead of saying, here's something we know that humans do and let's try to design this artificial task and see if animals can mimic human performance on it. So I think, the exciting thing about research is that we're all kind of learning to be better scientists as we go. So that's kind of the goal.
Okay, so great, Dr. Vonk. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. It was a very fun conversation, and we went through some general questions also to try to introduce people to this field of comparative evolutionary psychology and things like that. So perhaps in the future we could have another conversation to talk about more specific cognitive traits that you've been studying perhaps in our broader apes and other species as well. And so thank you a lot for taking the time.
No, it's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for reaching out to me. I appreciate it.
Okay, it was my pleasure. Thank you. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.